Greetings to my friends from Denver Urban Debate League. My name is John Rief, and starting in August 2020, I will be an assistant professor of rhetoric and debate and advisor to MSU Denver Debate at Metropolitan State University of Denver. I'm really excited to be taking on this role, and it's really an extension of a role I've already been engaged in as a lecturer and debate coach at MSU Denver. And I am very excited about the opportunities this position affords to continue collaborations with Denver Urban Debate League, including hosting tournaments. We've already hosted one in 2019 and judging at future tournaments. And I've already judged at several. Maybe I've judged some of you who are watching this film, but I hope to bring in some of my students to judge as well in the future when we're able to return to live tournaments. So before I jump into my discussion for today, I do want to give you some contact information so that you can get in touch with any questions you may have regarding today's discussion or debate in general. So you can reach me at any time at debate@msudenver.edu. That's debate@msudenver.edu. That's all lowercase, no punctuation aside from what I'm pronouncing. All right. So I am honored to have been invited to speak with you today about two key issues, and those are speaking about ideas that matter and speaking truth to power. And actually, as we work through these two issues, what you're going to find is my view is to suggest that they overlap significantly. That is, when you have an idea that matters, very often it will be an idea that unsettles power, right? That questions the state of things in some really important way. So I'm going to frame my brief discussion today in two parts. First, I draw some key insights from Martin Luther King Jr. regarding both ideas that matter and the challenges facing those who would like to speak truth to power. And second, I will discuss how these ideas relate to key learning outcomes in debate. So the way I'm going to discuss Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideas is to bring forward a few passages from one of his most famous pieces of writing, and that's his letter from Birmingham jail, written in 1963. And the context for this letter is important. This letter is written in response to a statement by white members of the clergy regarding their concerns about Martin Luther King Jr.'s activities and the wider civil rights movement while he was in prison in Birmingham, Alabama in April 1963. And so what King is doing here is he's responding to a series of critiques leveled against his chosen methods of protest and engagement. And I'm going to ask a few questions here as I jump into the text. I can't work through the whole text. I highly recommend that if you haven't already read it, that you do after watching this video. But I can pull out, I think, some of the key themes that will relate to this issue of King's work, and then relate those ideas to participation in debate and forensics. So one of the main questions that I want to ask is, what kinds of ideas matter? That is, what ideas truly matter to us as individuals and communities? And I would argue, following King, that those ideas that matter most relate to questions of justice that bring communities together in shared responsibility and action. And here I'm going to pull forward one of King's most important passages, and it has to do with fighting injustice and building communities to fight injustice. So, quote, "I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider." So I think King is up to two things here. One is more immediate to his specific environment and his time in history, and one is more transcendent and universal. So in terms of his immediate moment, one of the things that King is addressing is a pretty common critique of protest movements, and that is that they're being run by what King calls outside agitators, right? That he's come in and started something that would otherwise not have really been an issue. And what King is suggesting is that no, this is not the case. that the civil rights movement, the movement to dismantle racism in the United States, is of global concern to everyone within the country, and that specifically among Black communities, uh, there's a kind of there's a necessity of working together, of coming together to fight larger structures of power. But in addition to this more immediate concern that he's engaging, I think he's talking about a larger perspective that has to do with all of history. And this really relates to the key line in this passage, and that is injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. One of the things we can gather from this line is the idea that we are all responsible for injustice wherever it's happening in the world. And the ideas that matter most are going to be those that bring communities, even far flung and disparate communities, together in the pursuit of justice for everyone. So transcendent ideas really matter, ideas that stitch people together into projects of achieving social justice. Those are the ideas that will come to matter most. So the second question I want to pose, and we'll get some insight from King on this, is what are the consequences of speaking truth to power? So one of the things that King addresses in the letter is that sometimes we're going to be criticized for speaking truth to power, for engaging in protest. He's being criticized in this moment for his actions. He's being told that his protests are causing problems, that they're not addressing the issue of racism in the best way. And his argument is to suggest that we need to always remember justice requires sacrifice, and injustice is really the cause of harm to community. So he's trying to think about where is blame here? Who really do we need to talk to in order to understand, or think about in order to understand why things are unfolding the way they are in the 1960s, which is King's era, and why they unfold the way they do, for instance, in our own time, with Black Lives Matter and a host of other movements taking action, protesting in order to dismantle systemic racism. So I'm going to read a quote from the letter that I think addresses this issue head on. Quote, "You deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham, but I am sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. I am sure that each of you would want to go beyond the superficial social analyst who looks merely at effects and does not grapple with underlying causes." So I think that one of the key terms here is underlying causes. Ideas that matter will address those underlying causes of whatever issue you're trying to get at or deal with. And underlying causes are something that we need to remember are very easy to ignore when one takes a privileged position or has a privileged position, right? One of the things King is saying is that those who are criticizing him really are coming at it from a perspective that doesn't fully understand the underlying causes of why it's important to dismantle racism, that can ignore racism or aren't affected by it in the same way that he is and that his community is. And so we do need to take care when we're addressing ideas that matter, when we're addressing underlying causes, that we are not inappropriately importing a privileged point of view into the conversation. And this is really a key insight. It's one that, for instance, Linda Alcoff, who's a wonderful thinker on issues like this, has suggested. Like, we need to be careful about speaking for others or imposing our understanding on others, and instead need to be open to hearing from voices of oppressed, traditionally marginalized individuals. That those kinds of voices, those perspectives, should inform the way we think about underlying causes of injustice. And we may never have perfect understanding across boundaries, across different communities, but trying to find empathy rather than imposing oneself is really crucial to discovering and talking about ideas that will really change the world. So finally, this is the last sort of question or issue I want to pull out of the letter. How do you determine when it's necessary to speak about ideas that challenge the powerful, right? How do you approach, like, even figuring out when should I be engaged in this kind of a practice? And King introduces several criteria that I think are really helpful for determining situations that are unjust, like really seeing the injustice and thinking about taking action on it. And here he's talking about the law, but I think we can really expand it to think about any practices, norms, or behaviors that are exclusionary or oppressive. So let me just work through what are really 4 criteria in King's account for unjust laws. And we'll say unjust practices, unjust behaviors as well. So any law, this is the first one, any law, quote, out of harmony with the moral law, any law that degrades human personality, that is unjust. Okay. So what King is dealing with here in this criterion is thinking about this sort of moral sense, our conscience. Like we'll be able to see when things aren't right. It may just be in our gut, but we'll have this intuition. Things aren't right here. When we have that kind of an intuition, we need to start asking questions. We need to start thinking about what are the underlying causes of this feeling and who can I talk to or interact with or empathize with in order to better understand what's going on. Second criterion, a law imposed by a majority on a minority that really only affects the minority, right? So let's be specific about what this means. What King is really talking about here are all the laws that were put into place after the Civil War, all the way through the 1960s, particularly in the South, but in a lot of other places as well, that limited equality, freedom of access, fairness for Black communities in the United States. So access to voting, freedom of movement, access to resources, to jobs, all of these things come into play here. And so anytime we see that there is a majority that is gaining benefits or is not impacted by certain kinds of laws, practices, or norms, while others are, this is a moment of injustice that we need to question. Third, a law imposed on a minority without their input or vote. No matter the community, no matter the group we're talking about, when there are rules, behaviors, laws, practices that are being imposed that are being imposed without the interaction, input, advice, consideration of everyone involved, then we really do have a system that is unjust. And we need to think about questioning that and increasing the inclusivity of our practices for determining what it is we should be doing on any given day in any given situation. So fourth, and this one is a little more complex, so I'm going to actually quote a long passage about it. So here's the quote, and then we'll talk about it. Quote, there are some instances when a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I was arrested Friday on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there's nothing wrong with an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade. But when the ordinance is used to preserve segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and peaceful protest, then it becomes unjust. That's the end of the quote. So think about moments where a law, even if it seems like it is reasonable, if it's being applied in a problematic way to a specific group, then we need to ask questions about underlying causes, about why it's being used in that way, and how we might begin to challenge it. So in a very general sense, what we're talking about is this basic notion that just because something is a law or is the norm or is the way we've done things in the past does not mean it's just. We need to critically question the world around us and really interrogate why it is the way it is. Then the ideas that matter most will emerge, the ideas that allow us to talk about and dismantle the oppression that we see will come to us, a pursuit of justice will be realized. So now that we have King in place, I want to kind of transition into a discussion about debate and forensics and to think about what it is all of us are doing to discover ideas that matter and speak truth to power, and how King's ideas can really influence our motivations for doing so. So, building from King's ideas, I now want to discuss how debate can provide a platform for inculcating the concepts we've already talked about and developing a keen sense both for addressing ideas that matter most and cultivating skills in speaking truth to power. So before I do so, though, I do want to say something. Please remember that debate is not about winning primarily. Right? So if you never achieve a whole lot of success in debate, that doesn't matter. Right? What matters is that you approach your participation in the activity with the right motivation, with an eye towards why it is you're doing this. You're not doing it so that you have a little collection of trophies to leave on a shelf for the rest of your life and to point at, right? You're doing this because you want to build skills that will matter in your professional and civic life. That's not to say debate shouldn't be fun. Please make sure to have fun, but also keep one eye on that larger goal. So, how can King's ideas help us to think about our motivations for participation in debate? I want to talk about this in 3 different ways and through 3 different lenses. So first, I want to talk about switching sides, right? Taking different sides on a topic and how we might think about that as helping us to build skills in speaking truth to power and in identifying the ideas that really matter. Second, I want to talk about audience adaptation, so framing messages for a variety of different audiences. And third, I want to talk about critical questioning as kind of a core, I guess, principle of the activity. So first, switching sides. I want to talk about switching sides as really a fundamentally moral endeavor. So mirroring King's concern that we develop a broader perspective by seeking justice beyond our immediate community, I contend, following debate luminaries like Starr Muir, that switching sides offers opportunities to understand different perspectives and appreciate how and why people believe what they do. Never forget that the most important ideas, whether they relate to addressing and overcoming racist and other oppressive modes of social, cultural, and political life, or environmental concerns that place our planet at risk, can be understood and appreciated in a number of ways. So, coming to know how others think and feel about these issues will make you a stronger advocate from your own perspective on them, and one who can speak to numerous individuals and diverse audiences on the ideas that matter most. But, I'm going to have a but as I work through each of these, but keep in mind the risks of switching sides on topics. One such risk is that your own capacity to develop opinions and strongly advocate for them may be undermined. And this has come up in debate and argumentation literature. Never forget that the point is not to be able to defend or argue for any argument, right? Any argument you can think of, but to find the best possible versions of arguments that stretch beyond your own perspective and are thus more likely to sway a larger audience. So one of the concerns in sort of discussions about debate among practitioners that sometimes seeps into some conversations in the literature is this issue of opinion formation in debate and whether or not switching sides really advances the cause of helping our students identify and advocate for their positions. The truth is, in most cases, it does exactly that, I think. But there is this risk that you may begin to sort of lose an ability to form a strong conviction. You spend a lot of time questioning, thinking about the other side, empathizing with a variety of viewpoints, and less time thinking about, okay, how do I use all of this to frame an effective and ethical approach to advocacy in the real world? And that's really the goal, right? Empathy as a way into better or best versions of arguments. Okay, second, I want to talk about audience adaptation and speaking truth to the many. So remember that while King was a critic of the actual state of his democracy, he was also an expert at crafting messages that transcended many, though not all, of the divisions in his society. So he was, in many ways, questioning the state of democracy at the time, but also trying to build a democracy that would work better. So, in other words, he was an excellent speaker who could adapt his message to his moment and immediate audience, while also speaking to larger truths in his historical and cultural moment. And one of the greatest skills offered by a debate education is the ability to adapt your message, your truth, to a variety of audiences. This is especially true at tournaments with open judging, where you do not get to decide who your judges will be. But beware of this skill. The one risk is that you adapt too much, forget your own voice, and lose the power and strength of your appeal. While you should endeavor to speak to a variety of different people when you advocate for truth and justice, never give up on the uniqueness of your voice and your point of view. Allow this to shine as you find ways to deliver it to different audiences in the most impactful ways possible. In short, too much adaptation is problematic. Too little, and your message will be lost in the cacophony of disagreement that is democracy. And finally, there will always be those who will not agree with you. Okay, you will always run into people that you cannot persuade. Don't hold yourself to the standard of convincing everyone. Put another way, the most important ideas are often the least popular, at least at first. You may be the lone voice calling out into a void of attention, but with tenacity and attention to how your message might best receive uptake, you may find your way into the minds and hearts of ever larger groups. So don't fall victim to the notion that simply because an idea or argument fails once, it must always fail. Rethink, rework, regroup, and keep moving. All right. Third and finally, critical questions and taking nothing for granted. One of the skills you will develop in debate is the notion that everything is up to critical scrutiny. That is, we should question everything we think we know so as to hold ourselves accountable to evidence and truth. This does not mean that you should never develop beliefs and convictions. Instead, what it means is that you should remain open to the idea that you may be wrong, and most importantly, that the way things are, or the beliefs that most people have, are wrong. Remember King's argument that blame and justice can only be realized with a proper understanding of history and an embedded criticism of the law and culture. Right? Challenge the practices and laws that seem unjust to you. Do not allow others to place blame on you for challenging such practices and laws when it is these very things that have created an unjust environment in the first place. But always remember that there is a time for critical questioning and intense argument testing, like in a debate round, and a time for advocacy and action in the real world. So what happens in a debate is not necessarily what we need to be doing in an actual encounter. Right? We're not always testing an argument to the nth degree. Sometimes we're engaged in advocacy, in reaching out, in empathizing with people, in reaching mutual understanding. Right? There are all these different possible trajectories that we can engage in. So never forget this connection to the external world and try to cultivate your efforts in the direction of building cognitive and speaking skills that will translate into social change. All right. So just to review, we've talked a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr., about building ideas that matter, right? Ideas that transcend a specific or particular point of view, ideas that address underlying causes. That was King's term. And finally, ideas that emerge from our sense that something is wrong with our society, our community, with our practices. We've also talked about how to relate these ideas to elements of debate participation. So switching sides as one way into cultivating transcendent or more universal ideas that will appeal to a broad audience. Right? Audience adaptation as a means to think about our role as advocates to address a variety of different audiences on questions of underlying cause or on issues that are most important. And third and finally, critical questioning, right? Not taking for granted the way things are, whether we're talking about the law or our practices or the way our community operates. All of these things should be open to critical scrutiny, but we should also translate that critical scrutiny into advocacy. So with all that in mind, I'd just like to end with a final appeal to your generation. So it is your generation to whom we now turn to help us swing the tide of history in the right direction. From institutional racism to COVID-19, ongoing threats to our democratic ways of life, and environmental destruction that may eventually make our world uninhabitable for many, we need your help. We need you to research and test arguments. Be aware of the issues of the day. Stretch your minds, hearts, and voices to the largest possible extent. And be prepared to stand firm in convictions aimed at achieving justice for an ever wider number of people. So please dig deep, find your voices, and push us forward. I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much, and I look forward to future opportunities to discuss these ideas and others. And good luck. Enjoy the rest of your summer.